The arrows should have stopped. They did not. A Roman legionary raised his shield above his head and felt the impacts arrive like hail on a copper roof, one after another, without pause, without mercy. 7 legions had crossed the Euphrates, expecting a battle they understood. Heavy infantry against whatever stood before them. Walls of men, walls of shields. The Roman machine grinding forward until the enemy broke. That was the doctrine. That was the certainty. What stood before them rode on horses. A sound reached the Roman lines first. Low, steady, relentless. Parthian war drums, carried across the flat desert on a wind that offered no shade and no water. The rhythm did not falter. It did not quicken. It simply continued, as though the desert itself had learned to breathe. Then came the arrows. They rose in a high arc, thousands at once, darkening the pale sky over Carrhae. Legionaries locked their shields into the testudo formation, the tortoise, the formation that had saved Rome in 100 desperate sieges. The arrows struck the shield roofs and punched through. Some penetrated the overlapping plates entirely. Men fell inside the formation. The formation held. The arrows kept coming. When the Romans attempted to advance, the horsemen simply retreated, always maintaining the same distance, always loosing. When the Romans stood still, the arrows continued. When the Romans charged, the riders melted away across the sand and reappeared on their flanks. Then a different sound joined the drums, heavier, closer. The ground trembled. Armored horsemen appeared through the dust, mounted warriors and their mounts wrapped in scale and plate, lances couched underarm, aimed at the gaps between the shields. The cataphracts struck the Roman lines at full gallop, and the shields that it held against arrows splintered against the weight of armored cavalry. A Roman eagle standard swayed above the carnage. It tipped forward. It fell. An old man in a general's crimson cloak stood among the dead. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. He had been called the richest man in Rome. He had come east seeking glory to match the conquests of Caesar and Pompey. What he found was a desert that offered no quarter, and an enemy who refused to fight on his terms. The arrows should have stopped by now. They did not. And the question that would haunt Rome for generations was already forming in the dust and the silence between the drumbeats. How does an empire fight an enemy it cannot reach? In the year 53 before the Common Era, the Roman Republic had never been larger. Its dominions reached from the stormy coast of the Atlantic to the ancient cities of the Levant. No king on earth commanded more territory, more soldiers, or more wealth than the Senate and people of Rome. But Rome was not ruled by kings. It was ruled by 3 men. Pompey the Great held the West, governing his provinces with the authority of a conqueror. Julius Caesar was in Gaul, carving his name into the forests and river banks of a land that had never bowed to Rome. And then there was the 3rd man, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the richest citizen Rome had ever produced. He had bought mines, bought land, bought politicians, and bought influence on a scale that stunned even his peers. Decades earlier, he had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus, lining the Appian Way with crosses as proof of his resolve. Yet that victory had never fully belonged to him. Pompey had arrived at the last moment and claimed the credit. The sting of that theft never left Crassus. He was now in his early 60s, and the two men who shared power with him were outpacing him in the one currency he could not simply purchase: glory. Caesar was slaughtering tribes and bridging the Rhine. Pompey had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and humiliated Eastern kings. Crassus needed a triumph of his own, a war so decisive that no rival could diminish it. He looked east, toward a rival empire that had stood for centuries beyond the Euphrates: Parthia. A land of horsemen and silk, of desert fortresses and royal dynasties that traced their blood to the old Persian kings. Rome and Parthia had circled each other for a generation, trading threats across a border neither fully controlled. Crassus believed Parthia was ripe for conquest. He believed its cavalry could not withstand the discipline of Roman legions. He was wrong, and the desert would prove it. In 53 BC, the Roman Republic has never been larger. Its borders stretch from the Atlantic coast of Gaul to the Levantine shore. 700 years of war, politics, and conquest have built an empire without an emperor. The Republic is governed by a fragile arrangement, an unofficial alliance of three men that historians will later call the First Triumvirate. Two of them dominate the western horizon. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, commands Rome's fleets and legions in the west, organizing provinces and securing the sea lanes. Gaius Julius Caesar, younger and more ruthless, is 3 years into his conquest of Gaul, subduing tribe after tribe and sending back gold, slaves, and dispatches that the Senate reads with growing unease. Each man's success only raises the stakes for the others. And then there is the third man, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He is 60 years old. He is the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man the Mediterranean world has ever produced. His fortune was built on slaves, silver mines, and real estate purchased cheap from proscribed families whose blood was still wet on their doorposts. He bought his way into politics, funded elections, and bankrolled the careers of lesser men who owed him everything. 30 years earlier, he crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus, though even that victory was partly Pompey's to claim, Pompey arriving in time to mop up the fugitives and take credit for ending the war. Crassus has money. He has political power. What he lacks is a military triumph worthy of Pompey and Caesar. In Rome, wealth opens doors, but military glory holds them open. The Republic remembers conquerors, not accountants. Crassus looks east. Beyond the province of Syria, beyond the Roman frontier along the Euphrates, lies a kingdom most Romans know only by rumor: Parthia. He sees wealth waiting to be seized, a throne waiting to be toppled, and a campaign that will finally place him beside Pompey and Caesar in the ranks of Rome's immortal commanders. What waits beyond that river is something else entirely. The Parthian Empire did not look like Rome. It had no marble forums, no paved road networks binding distant provinces to a single capital. Its heart was the saddle. From the Euphrates to the Indus, from the Caspian steppes to the Persian Gulf, a vast arc of territory answered to a dynasty that measured wealth in horses, silk, and steel. The Arsacids had built their kingdom on the ruins of Alexander's successors, and they had learned something Rome had not yet encountered. A cavalry army does not need to hold ground. It needs only to move. Parthian society trained its sons to ride before they could read. Noble families raised mounted archers who could loose arrows at full gallop, twisting in the saddle to shoot behind them. The Romans would later call this the Parthian shot, and it would become a proverb. But on the plains of Mesopotamia, it was not a saying. It was a killing method, repeated thousands of times in a single afternoon, delivered by men who had practiced it since childhood. Alongside the horse archers rode a second force, heavier and more terrifying. Cataphracts, armoured lancers, both horse and rider wrapped in iron and bronze scales. When these charged, the ground shook. Their lances could punch through a shield wall. Their armor could turn a Roman javelin. A Parthian general could harass an enemy for hours with arrows, then commit his cataphracts at the exact moment fatigue broke the formation. Crassus studied this empire from Syria and reached three conclusions. Parthia was wealthy. Parthia was fragile. Parthia was ripe for conquest. He was right about the wealth. Silk and spices flowed through Parthian caravans, and the treasury at Ctesiphon glittered with tribute from 100 trade routes. But the second and third judgments would prove catastrophically wrong. Parthia was not brittle, and it was not undefended. The man who would demonstrate this was not yet known to Rome. His name was Surena, and he was young, brilliant, and patient. Marcus Licinius Crassus is not a soldier's soldier. He is Rome's richest man, and he built that fortune with a predator's patience. During the bloody proscriptions of Sulla, he bought confiscated property at desperate prices. He bought slave mines. He organized fire brigades that negotiated their fee while the buildings still burned. Every deal tightened his grip on the city's wealth. He did command armies, and in 71 BC he suppressed the Spartacus slave revolt, a brutal campaign that ended with 6,000 captives crucified along the Appian Way. But the final credit did not belong to him. Pompey Magnus arrived with his legions, swept up the remnants, and claimed the victory for himself. Crassus never forgot that humiliation. Now, in his early 60s, he watches Pompey and Julius Caesar divide the Roman world between them. Caesar conquers Gaul and crosses the Rhine. Pompey commands the east and the sea. Crassus has money, but money alone does not buy the kind of glory that silences rivals in the Senate. He needs a war of his own, a triumph so total that no one can steal the laurels afterward. Parthia sits east of the Euphrates, an empire of silk and silver that Roman senators imagine as wealthy, fragile, and ripe for the taking. Crassus believes he can march in, seize its treasuries, and return to Rome as the undisputed first man of the Republic. He is governor of Syria, and his son Publius rides beside him, commanding a cavalry detachment hardened in Caesar's Gallic campaigns. 7 legions march in his column, with auxiliaries and Gallic horsemen swelling the ranks to perhaps 40 or 50,000 men. The Armenian king Artavasdes offers a safer route through the mountains, where Parthian horsemen would lose their advantage. Crassus listens and then chooses the desert. Crassus gathers his forces in Syria. 7 legions march under his command, veterans and recruits alike, perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 men in total when counting auxiliaries and allied detachments. Gallic cavalry rides alongside, and his own son Publius leads them, a young officer tempered in Caesar's Gallic campaigns, where he learned to charge and pursue a broken enemy. Publius brings the confidence of a man who has never lost a battle, and Crassus trusts that confidence more than any map. The Armenian king, Artavasdes, arrives at Crassus's winter camp with counsel and an offer. He proposes a route through the highlands of Armenia, where mountains and forests would shelter Roman infantry from Parthian horsemen. In that terrain, cavalry loses its reach. Arrows scatter among trees. Cataphracts cannot build momentum on rocky ground. The Armenian path is longer but safer, and Artavasdes promises to supply the army along the way and to add his own horsemen to the march. Crassus listens. Then he refuses. The reasons are tangled, and the sources do not fully agree. Some ancient writers say he distrusted Armenian motives, suspecting Artavasdes wanted to drag Rome into a different war for Armenian interests. Others suggest simple impatience, the hunger of a man in his 60s who has waited decades for a command worthy of his name and fortune. The direct route across Mesopotamia is shorter on paper. It cuts straight to the heart of Parthian territory. Crassus believes speed will protect him. He is wrong. The desert offers no cover, no water, no shade, no respite. It is a killing ground for infantry that cannot close with its enemy. But Crassus does not know this yet, or does not care. He has 7 legions and a son who has never failed him. He chooses the flat, open plain where every Parthian arrow will find its mark, where every horseman will hold the advantage of distance and mobility over men who cannot run. The decision is made. The army turns south toward the open desert, and the desert is already waiting. In the spring of 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus led his 7 legions across the Euphrates at the crossing point of Zeugma. The river was wide and slow at that stretch, and the Roman columns filed over pontoon bridges in disciplined order. No enemy contested the crossing. No Parthian patrol appeared on the far bank. The silence seemed to confirm Crassus in his belief that this war would be won by presence alone. The first Mesopotamian settlements reinforced that conviction. Towns along the northern approach opened their gates without drawing a sword. Greek-speaking communities, descendants of settlers planted here generations earlier by Alexander's successors, welcomed the Romans as liberators. They offered grain, intelligence, and warm words about how little love the local populations bore for their Parthian overlords. Crassus accepted every greeting as proof that the desert route had been the right choice. He pressed the army south and east toward Carrhae, a modest trading town on the Balik River. Carrhae sat at the edge of the fertile strip where irrigation channels fed barley fields and orchards before the land hardened into open steppe. Roman scouts reported no concentration of Parthian forces anywhere ahead. The supply line back to the Euphrates remained intact. Publius Crassus, his son, rode with the cavalry screen, having returned from Gaul with hard-earned experience. By every visible measure, the campaign resembled an administrative progress more than an invasion. Then a local Arab chieftain named Ariamnes arrived at the Roman camp. He presented himself as an ally, a man who had cooperated with Roman agents before, and who now offered to guide the army to a decisive engagement with the Parthians. He spoke with urgency. He said the enemy was close, that they could be caught, that the moment demanded speed. He urged Crassus to leave the river and march directly across the open desert, where the distance to the Parthians would be shortest. The offer was tempting to a commander who had expected no serious resistance, and it was also the moment the campaign began to leave safe ground behind. The first Mesopotamian settlements offered no resistance. Towns along the upper Euphrates opened their gates as Roman standards appeared on the horizon. Greek-speaking communities in northern Mesopotamia welcomed the legions as liberators rather than conquerors. Supply flowed freely. Garrison duties seemed a greater concern than combat. Crassus pressed the column southeast toward Carrhae, a modest trading post on the Balik River. The town held no strategic prize. It sat on flat, open ground with neither walls of consequence nor garrison to speak of. Yet Crassus believed the whole campaign would unfold this way, a procession through surrendered territory rather than a war. Then a figure emerged from the desert fringe. Ariamnes, a local Arab chieftain, presented himself to the Roman command as a friend and ally of the Republic. He had guided Roman interests before, or so he claimed, and he spoke with confidence about the terrain ahead. The Parthians, he told Crassus, were far away. Their king had fled. Their army was scattered. The road to victory lay not along the river, but straight across open desert, where the legions could close the distance before the enemy regrouped. It was precisely what a confident commander wanted to hear. The river route was slower. It hugged supply lines, offered safety but no glory. The desert route promised speed, decisive contact, and a swift end to the campaign. Some ancient sources record Ariamnes as a genuine ally caught by circumstances. Others suspect he was a Parthian agent, planted to lure the legions into terrain where their discipline and engineering counted for nothing. The records are incomplete, and the truth died with the men who marched that road. What survived is the decision itself. Crassus turned the column away from the water. 7 legions, auxiliaries, cavalry, and baggage trains swung into the open steppe, where ground stretched flat and featureless to every horizon. The river fell driving them. The shade disappeared. And a man who had spent his life mastering Roman warfare was about to discover what that mastery was worth on ground where none of it applied. Crassus trusts the Arab chieftain. Ariamnes has guided Roman forces before, and his counsel carries the weight of past service. He tells Crassus that the Parthian king is far away, that the frontier is weakly held, that a rapid advance will catch the enemy unprepared. The argument appeals to everything Crassus wants to believe. He orders the army to leave the Balik River and march directly across the open desert. The column stretches over miles of cracked earth and blowing sand. The legionaries carry their heavy packs, their entrenching tools, their siege equipment. Every item that makes a Roman army formidable behind walls or on prepared ground now drags at their heels across a landscape with no walls at all. The river falls behind them. The supply line thins. The terrain offers nothing to fortify, nothing to engineer, nothing to hold. Rome's greatest strengths, the disciplines that conquered Greece and Carthage and Gaul, become dead weight in this emptiness. Somewhere ahead, already watching, rides a man the Romans have never heard of. His name is Surena. He belongs to the Surena family, hereditary defenders of Parthia's eastern frontier, and he is young. Sources place him at roughly 30 years old, though the records are incomplete, and some accounts emphasize his youth to sharpen the contrast with Crassus, who is past 60. Surena commands no vast host. His force numbers about 10,000, and nearly all of them are cavalry. There are horse archers, fast and lightly armored, and there is a smaller corps of cataphracts, heavy lancers encased in iron from head to hoof. King Orodes II has taken the main Parthian army north into Armenia, leaving Surena with orders to delay the Roman advance. But Surena does not intend to merely delay. He has read this desert the way a general reads a battlefield, and he understands exactly what the open ground offers a man who rides against men who walk. The Romans are moving into a country where exhaustion is a weapon and distance is an ambush. Surena's army is not large by Roman standards. 10,000 horsemen ride under his command, and not one infantryman walks among them. It is built for speed, for the open desert where movement is survival. The bulk of his riders are horse archers. Each carries a composite bow of horn and sinew, designed to punch through armor at distance. Behind them ride supply camels carrying more arrows. A Parthian horse archer does not need to charge. He needs only to circle, to lose, to circle again, and to never stop moving. At the core of Surena's force ride the cataphracts. These are heavy lancers, both horse and rider encased in iron and bronze scales. They are fewer and slower, but their purpose is decisive. They do not harass, they shatter. When the enemy is weakened or broken in spirit, the cataphracts charge home with lances leveled and do not pull back. King Orodes II has made a calculated gamble. He has taken the main Parthian army north into Armenia, leaving Surena with only a fraction of Parthia's strength. The king trusts his young general to delay and harass, to deny Crassus the battle the Romans want. But Surena is not planning to delay. He plans to destroy. His strategy is elegant. He will let the desert do its work first. He will draw the Romans deeper into waterless ground, away from the Euphrates and any hope of reinforcement. He will let heat and thirst soften the legions before a single arrow flies. When the Roman column is stretched and trapped, he will close the trap. Surena is perhaps 30 years old. Ancient sources do not agree on the exact count, and the records are incomplete. But what survives shows a commander who understood his enemy better than his enemy understood him. He had studied Roman formations, the testudo, the square. He knew that heavy infantry, however disciplined, cannot win a battle it cannot reach. His name will echo for centuries, but the victory he is about to win will cost him his life within a year. The Roman column stretched across the hard, flat sand like a steel wound. 7 legions, plus auxiliaries and cavalry, moved in a long line that offered no shelter and no shade. The ground was waterless, the air was dry. Every step deeper into the desert carried the army farther from the Euphrates and closer to whatever waited ahead. Then Ariamnes vanished. The Arab guide who had promised safe passage, who had urged Crassus to march inland, simply disappeared from the column. Whether he had been a Parthian agent all along or merely abandoned a losing cause, the records do not say. What mattered was that the Romans were now crossing open ground with no reliable local knowledge and no guide. Scouts rode back with urgent reports. Parthian cavalry had been sighted ahead, moving fast. Crassus did not pause to reconsider his route. He ordered a hasty march, pressing the column toward the town of Carrhae before contact could be forced. The legionaries obeyed, but they carried everything on their backs: mail shirts, shields, rations, entrenching tools, tent stakes. The weight was enormous. The sun added its own punishment, and the dust rose with every footfall, coating lips and lungs. Morale began to crack. Men who had marched through Gaul and Syria now stumbled through a landscape that offered nothing but heat and silence. A young cavalry officer named Gaius Cassius Longinus rode forward to find Crassus.
Cassius was sharp, ambitious, and not yet 30. He urged the commander to turn the army around and retrace its steps to the Euphrates, where water and supply lines still held. Retreat now, he argued, was not weakness, but survival. Crassus refused. He believed that pulling back would signal fear to his own men and invite pursuit from the Parthians. The army would press on toward Carrhae. It was now fully committed to the open plain, and the open plain belonged to horsemen who could see farther, ride faster, and strike from directions no Roman square could predict. The decision would define everything that followed. The Roman column had been marching for hours across terrain that offered nothing: no shade, no water, no cover of any kind. The sun climbed higher, and with it rose the temperature of the sand beneath every sandaled foot. Legionaries carried close to 30 kilograms each: mail shirts, shields, rations, tools, and the heavy pilum that gave them their killing edge. On open ground, that weight was a burden. In the desert, it became a sentence. Sweat-soaked wool tunics, dust-coated throats and eyes. Men who had fought Gauls and Spartans now fought something simpler and more relentless: heat. There were no enemy formations visible yet, but the landscape itself seemed hostile. The flat plain offered no natural defensible position, no ridge to anchor a flank, no forest to screen a withdrawal. Every direction looked identical, and that sameness wore at a soldier's nerve. Somewhere ahead, the Arab guide Ariamnes had vanished. Whether he was a Parthian agent or an opportunistic deserter, the records are incomplete. What mattered was that the man who promised to lead Crassus to a quick and decisive engagement was gone, and the army was still marching deeper into open ground. A young cavalry officer named Gaius Cassius Longinus rode forward. Cassius was sharp-eyed, politically ambitious, and militarily perceptive. He urged Crassus to halt the advance and retrace the column steps to the Balissus River, where water and a defensible position could at least be secured. It was sound counsel. Crassus refused. He believed that turning back would signal weakness to his own men and to the enemy he was certain was near. His confidence had carried him through decades of politics and profit, through alliances with Pompey and Caesar, through the suppression of Spartacus and his rebels. It would not bend now, not in front of 40,000 soldiers who watched his every gesture and took their courage from his face. The army pressed on. The plain stretched ahead, empty and shimmering with heat. And then, on the horizon, shapes began to move. Surena's horse archers appear on the horizon. They do not advance in a solid wall. They ride in loose, rotating formations, each squadron wheeling independently across the flat ground. The dust they raise hangs in the still desert air.
Crassus watches them come. He has seen cavalry before. He has never seen cavalry like this. The Romans form a massive square. Some accounts describe a single great square. Others describe a series of connected squares, each legion facing outward. The records are incomplete, and sources disagree on the exact geometry. But every account agrees on one thing: the shields interlocked on all sides. The horse archers circle at range. They do not charge. They do not close. They pour arrows into the packed infantry from every direction at once. Each Parthian bow is a composite recurve, layered horn and sinew, compact enough to fire from horseback, yet powerful enough to drive shafts through mail at distance. The arrows strike shields, armor, exposed limbs, and the gaps between men who cannot spread out without breaking the formation. The Romans cannot close. Every time a century shifts to face the nearest riders, the riders simply wheel away. The square holds, but holding is not fighting. Holding is surviving. Trumpets sound along the Roman line. Orders pass from cohort to cohort. The legions tighten their ranks and raise their shields higher. Arrows embed in the wooden cores. Shafts snap against bronze bosses. Men fall where they stand, and the ranks close over them. Crassus scans the circling riders. His cavalry cannot catch them. His infantry cannot reach them. The desert offers no cover, no trees, no broken ground. Just flat, open plain in every direction. Then he notices something that should offer hope. The archers are spending arrows at a tremendous rate. No cavalryman can carry enough shafts to sustain this volume for long. Every army in the Mediterranean fights with finite ammunition. The Romans know this. They have waited out archers before. The volleys continue. Minutes pass. The arrows do not thin. They do not slow. If anything, the tempo increases, and the drumbeats from the Parthian line grow louder. The Roman squares hold. Shields lock above and around. Arrows thud into the testudo by the thousands. Men bleed through the gaps in their armor. The wounded fall where they stand. There is no room to collapse without breaking the formation. Crassus watches from the center of the largest square. He has fought Spartacus. He has governed provinces. He has never seen anything like this. His heavy infantry cannot reach the enemy. His cavalry cannot outpace them. Every Roman instinct tells him to close the distance and fight hand to hand. The Parthians will not allow it. Then a detail emerges that shifts everything. The Romans have been counting arrows. Every bowman carries a finite quiver. At this rate of fire, the shafts should be gone. The barrage should weaken. It does not. Behind the screen of mounted archers, a long train of camels moves across the desert floor. Each animal carries baskets packed with replacement arrows. Riders gallop to the camels, refill, and return to the line. The supply is enormous. The records are incomplete on exact numbers, but ancient sources describe the reserve as vast enough to sustain the bombardment for hours. Surena has engineered this engagement for endurance, not for a single decisive clash. He is not trying to break the Roman line in one charge. He is trying to exhaust it. Crassus recognizes the trap too slowly. His legions are burning through stamina, water, and daylight all at once. Standing still means death by attrition. Moving means exposing gaps. He orders his son Publius to take the Gallic cavalry and a force of infantry and strike the archers directly.
It is the only answer the Roman tactical mind can produce. Close with the enemy. Force a fight on Roman terms. Publius gathers his riders. Some of the Gauls ride bareback, their long swords ready. They are about to charge into a foe that has never intended to stand and receive them. Crassus watched his son ride out.
Publius Licinius Crassus led a detachment of Gallic cavalry, augmented by infantry and archers, straight toward the swirling screen of Parthian horsemen. The Gauls were ferocious warriors. Some rode bareback, gripping their mounts with their legs alone. Their long swords could reach a Parthian rider where shorter Roman weapons could not. For a brief moment, it looked like a breakthrough. The horse archers broke formation and pulled away. Publius urged his men forward. The Romans chased them across the open ground. This was exactly what Surena wanted. The retreat was manufactured. Every step drew Publius farther from the protective Roman formations. Every stride widened the gap between his detachment and the main body of 7 legions. The Gauls were fast, but they were charging into a trap designed by a general who understood momentum better than anyone on that field. Once the Roman force was isolated and winded, the real weapon arrived. The cataphracts emerged. These were men and horses, both encased in scale armor and plate, their lances leveled, advancing as a single wall of metal. The ground trembled beneath their weight. There was no maneuver left for Publius. His cavalry could not outrun them. His infantry could not hold against them. The cataphracts crashed into the Roman detachment and sealed it shut. Publius himself fell in the fighting. Sources disagree on the exact manner of his death. Some accounts say he ordered his shield-bearer to kill him rather than face capture. Others suggest he died leading a final, desperate charge. The records are incomplete, but the outcome is not. His entire force was annihilated, and Crassus, watching from the main line, could now see what the Parthians brought back as proof. Publius fell in the dust of a plain he had never been meant to survive. The sources do not agree on every detail of his death. Most accounts say he saw the end clearly, that the arrows had done their work and the cataphracts had closed the ring. Rather than be taken alive by Parthian horsemen, he ordered his own shield-bearer to drive a blade through his body. Others suggest the wound came in the press of fighting, and the story of the ordered death was shaped later by men who needed a noble ending. What is certain is that Publius died there, surrounded, and that his detachment died with him, to the last man who could still hold a weapon. The Parthians were not finished with him. They cut off his head and his right hand. They mounted both on a spear and rode that spear back toward the main Roman formation. Crassus's men saw it coming across the open ground, a shape on a pole, bouncing with the gait of a horse, growing clearer with every stride. The son who had charged out hours before was now a trophy returning to his father's line. The effect on the Roman army was immediate. Groans moved through the ranks. Men who had held their nerve under arrow fire now broke composure. Some turned away, some stared. Officers tried to maintain the formation, but the sight stripped away the last illusion that the sortie had been a gamble that simply failed. It had been a trap by design. The horse archers had pulled Publius forward. The cataphracts had been waiting. Every step of the retreat had been measured, and every Roman who followed had been led into a killing ground
that Surena had prepared before the first arrow flew.
Now the remaining legionaries understood the full shape of their position. There would be no relief. No cavalry would come back to break the archers. No flanking force would strike the Parthians from an unexpected direction. The army that had crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions and the confidence of Rome was standing in the desert with its best offensive element already destroyed. The arrows had never stopped. They would not stop now. The sortie had been annihilated, destroyed to the last man. Now Surena made certain that Crassus would know it. Parthian riders carried Publius's severed head and his right hand through the desert on raised spear points. They rode along the full length of the Roman formation, so that every legionary could see what remained of the commander's son and the 6,000 men who had followed him. The display was deliberate. Surena understood that terror was itself a weapon, and that a broken spirit kills faster than any arrow. The effect on the Roman ranks was immediate. Groans spread through the legions. Men who had stood firm for hours faltered. Crassus himself, seeing his son's face paraded before him, staggered through the ranks. Ancient accounts say he wept openly, though some sources dispute the detail and the records are incomplete on his exact reaction. What is certain is that the general who had marched 7 legions into Mesopotamia with absolute confidence now stood among men who understood there would be no rescue. The arrows did not stop. Parthian horse archers continued their circling assault, loosing shafts into the packed Roman infantry from every angle. Some legionaries raised their shields above their heads, locking them together in the formation Romans called the testudo, the tortoise. But the Parthian arrows were driven with enough force to punch through the narrow gaps between shields. Men were struck in their hands, their feet, their exposed faces. They dropped where they stood, and the bodies piled in rows across the sand. The Parthian drums never ceased. That deep, rhythmic pounding rolled across the plain without interruption, a sound designed to remind every Roman that the horsemen were still out there, still circling, still loaded. Crassus dismounted from his horse and stood on foot among the infantry, sharing their exposure, trying by his presence to hold the collapsing formation together. He had no cavalry left to send. He had no plan left to try. The long day was far from over, and the desert had not yet given them its worst. The testudo was supposed to be Rome's answer to missile fire. Legionaries locked their shields above their heads, forming an overlapping shell of curved wood and leather. Against javelins, against most archers in the known world, it worked. Against Parthian composite bows drawn at close range by mounted archers, it was not enough. The arrows came in at angles designed to exploit every gap. They struck hands gripping shield rims. They struck feet pressed into the sand. They found the narrow spaces between a man's shoulder and his neighbor's shield arm. Legionaries dropped where they stood, and the men behind them closed the gap, and then those men dropped too. The drums did not stop. That steady, rhythmic pounding carried across the flat ground, and with each beat another volley arrived. Some Roman soldiers tried to advance toward the horse archers, but the Parthians simply retreated at a trot, kept their distance, and continued shooting. Others tried to hold position, and the arrows simply accumulated. The sand beneath the formation grew slick. Crassus had dismounted. He had sent his horse away, or someone had led it away, and now he stood on foot among the infantry. Sources disagree on whether this was a gesture of solidarity or a practical decision to prevent his cavalry from abandoning the line. What the records make clear is that he moved through the ranks, speaking to centurions, trying to hold the shrinking formation together. He was 62 years old, and the army around him was being dismantled, one man at a time. Then something changed. The light shifted. The sun dropped behind the western desert, and the arrows began to thin. Parthian bows relied on visibility, and the darkness reduced their accuracy. The drums faded. The horse archers pulled back toward their camp, their quivers nearly empty, their horses tired. Surena had no intention of finishing this in the dark. He would let the night do its own work, and at dawn, his riders would find whatever remained of the Roman army still sitting in the open, still surrounded, still waiting for an arrow that had not yet come. The night march began in silence. Crassus gave the order to withdraw toward Carrhae, and what remained of 7 legions rose from the sand where they had sheltered. There was no trumpet call, no formation, only thousands of men moving west through darkness, guided by stars and the distant memory of a town they had passed weeks before. The column stretched and broke within the first hour. Wounded soldiers could not keep pace. Men who had stood under arrow fire for hours now found that their legs would not carry them. They fell behind and were left. No one stopped to help. To stop was to die in the desert, alone, when the Parthian cavalry returned at dawn. Some units retained enough discipline to move together. Others dissolved into clusters of 20, 10, 5 men stumbling through the dark with no officer and no direction. The army that had crossed the Euphrates as a coordinated military force no longer existed as a single body. It was now fragments, drifting across open ground. A remnant reached Carrhae by morning. The town offered walls and a brief respite, but it could not sustain a siege. There were no supplies for thousands of starving, wounded soldiers. Carrhae was a way station, not a refuge. Surena had not pursued through the night. He did not need to. His cavalry rested, watered their horses, and waited for light. When dawn came, his scouts found the trail easily enough. Dead Romans marked the path from the battlefield to the town. Inside Carrhae, Crassus faced a choice no Roman commander of his rank had faced in a generation. He could attempt to hold the town and pray for relief that would not arrive. He could try another night march deeper into Roman territory. Or he could meet Surena and negotiate terms. The sources disagree on what happened next, but they agree on one thing. Crassus rode out to parley, and he did not ride back. Crassus sends word to Surena. He asks for terms. The Parthian commander agrees to a meeting on open ground between the two lines. What remains of the Roman army watches their general ride forward with a small escort. Surena arrives on horseback, flanked by officers in gleaming armor.
The conversation begins in formal language. Then something breaks. The sources diverge sharply here. Plutarch and Cassius Dio describe a parley that turns violent almost without warning. A Parthian officer reaches for Crassus. Roman attendants react. Blades are drawn. In the confusion, Crassus is struck down. Other accounts tell a colder story. In those versions, there is no negotiation at all. Surena never intended to let Crassus walk away. The Roman is seized and executed on the spot. His head is severed and carried to King Orodes as proof of victory. The records are incomplete, and historians still debate which version comes closer to truth. What no source disputes is the outcome. Marcus Licinius Crassus is dead. The wealthiest man in Rome, the man who crushed Spartacus, who shared the world with Pompey and Caesar, dies on a flat plain in Mesopotamia, far from any city he ever ruled. His head and his right hand are sent north to Orodes, who is already celebrating. The king receives them during a royal performance of Euripides' Bacchae. The head of Rome's great commander is held up on stage as a prop. The court applauds the play. Back at Carrhae, the survivors do not yet know.
They wait for word. They wait for orders that will never come. And in the silence that follows, the full scale of what has happened begins to emerge from the desert dust. The dust settles on the plain of Carrhae, and the scale of catastrophe becomes clear. Roughly 20,000 Roman soldiers lie dead on the sand. 10,000 more are captured, marched eastward into Parthia, and deported to the empire's far frontier. Some accounts place them at Merv, a Silk Road outpost thousands of miles from home, where they may have lived out their lives in exile. The records are incomplete, and historians still debate whether these men built settlements or simply vanished into the eastern populations. 7 legionary eagles, the sacred standards carried by every Roman legion, are lost to the enemy. In Roman military religion, the eagle is not merely a symbol. It is the spirit of the legion, the embodiment of Rome itself. To lose one is a humiliation. To lose 7 is an existential shock that reaches deep into the Republic's identity. The defeat at Carrhae becomes the worst Roman military disaster since Cannae, when Hannibal annihilated Roman legions at the height of the Second Punic War. But Cannae happened on Italian soil, against an invader on home ground. Carrhae happens hundreds of miles from Rome, in a desert the Republic had no strategic reason to enter, against an enemy Crassus underestimated at every turn. The political consequences are immediate and severe. Crassus is gone. His wealth, his influence, his carefully built alliance with Pompey and Caesar, all of it collapses with him on the Mesopotamian sand. The triumvirate that governed Rome through private arrangement now loses one of its 3 pillars, and the balance of power shifts irreversibly toward the 2 men who remain. But the deepest wound is the eagles. For 3 decades, Roman commanders will chase their recovery across the same unforgiving landscape. Mark Antony will lead a disastrous Parthian campaign in 36 BC and fail to reclaim them. The standards will not return until diplomacy, not war, finally brings them home. And while Rome counts its dead, the man who engineered this victory stands at the height of his power, but not for long. The 7 legionary eagles lost at Carrhae were not merely standards. They were sacred objects, carried into battle as embodiments of Rome itself, guarded by men who would rather die than see them fall. Their capture burned into the Roman imagination like few events before or since. For 3 decades, that wound would fester, driving men of ambition to seek revenge in the desert. Marcus Licinius Crassus had gone east chasing glory to match Pompey and Caesar. Instead, he left Rome humiliated, its legions shattered, and its prestige broken on a plain of sand and arrows. The political landscape he had helped shape now tilted violently.
The triumvirate he had held together began to fracture, and the Republic moved closer to its final civil wars. In 36 BC, Mark Antony marched into Parthia, determined to erase the shame of Carrhae. He brought a massive force, siege equipment, and the confidence of a man who believed the East could still be conquered. The campaign was a disaster. Antony lost thousands to harassment, disease, and starvation. His retreat through Armenia in winter became a nightmare of freezing marches and constant ambush. He returned to Rome having avenged nothing. The Parthian frontier held.
Rome learned, slowly and painfully, that the East could not be subdued by legions alone. The open desert favored the horse archer, the armoured cataphract, and the logistics of a civilization built around cavalry warfare. Crassus had proven what failure looked like. Antony proved it could happen again. Then, in 20 BC, a different kind of Roman leader tried a different approach. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, did not send legions into the desert, he sent envoys. And through negotiation rather than battle, he would recover what Crassus had lost. Augustus returns the eagles to Rome and declares the shame of Carrhae erased. But the standards come back through negotiation, not through victory on the field. No Roman army ever redeems that battlefield. The eagles are recovered, but the truth beneath them is harder to face. 7 legions were not defeated by a larger force. They were defeated by a smaller one. Crassus commanded perhaps 40,000 men. Surena brought roughly 10,000. The numbers alone should have favored Rome. They did not. The Parthian general wins not by matching Roman strength, but by refusing to engage on Roman terms. His horse archers never stand still. His cataphracts never charge without purpose. Every Roman formation, every shield wall, every testudo becomes a target rather than a solution. The legionary system is not broken. It is simply incomplete. It assumes an enemy that will close to melee. It assumes terrain that rewards discipline and depth. It assumes supply islands that can be maintained. At Carrhae, every one of those assumptions fails. Rome learns. Within a generation, the eastern frontier changes. Auxiliary cavalry units grow in number. Syrian and Arab archers appear on Roman muster rolls. Fortified supply posts stretch along the Euphrates. Legionaries still form the core, but the core is no longer the whole answer. Even Surena himself does not survive long after the battle. The Parthian king, suspicious of his general's rising fame, has him executed. The man who destroyed a Roman army never lives to enjoy the glory. But the lesson he left behind endures. A force that is faster, better supplied, and disciplined enough to hold its formations can break an army that is larger, slower, and trapped in the wrong terrain. A force that is faster, better supplied, and disciplined enough to hold its formations can break an army that is larger, slower, and trapped in the wrong terrain. The desert near Haran still holds no monument to the dead. No triumphal arch marks where 7 Roman legions vanished into sand and silence. The bones of 20,000 soldiers scattered across the plain, unburied, unclaimed, forgotten by the empire that sent them there. Crassus himself never left the desert. Accounts of his death vary, but every version ends the same way, with Rome's richest man dying on foreign soil,
far from the triumph he believed he deserved. Marcus Licinius Crassus sought a military victory to rival Pompey and Caesar. Instead, he delivered Rome its worst battlefield disaster since Carrhae. The eagles he carried across the Euphrates became trophies in Parthian temples. It would take decades and a diplomatic marriage before even a fraction of those captured standards returned to Roman hands.
Surena's victory was equally complete and equally brief. Within months of his triumph at Carrhae, the young general was executed on the orders of King Orodes, who feared the popularity his commander had earned through genius. The brilliance that shattered Rome's legions died on a king's suspicion, and Parthia lost its finest commander to the same politics that made him dangerous. The battle reshaped how Rome understood its own limits. The eastern frontier hardened into a permanent strategic problem that no number of legions could simply solve. Rome still marched east, but never again with such blind confidence against horse archers in open desert. The Parthian model of mobility, ranged firepower, and disciplined cavalry charges forced a permanent reassessment of what heavy infantry could and could not do. Centuries later, the name Carrhae still carries weight. Military academies study it as a textbook case of asymmetric warfare. Historians argue over every detail, from the size of Surena's force to the exact route of Crassus's retreat. The sources disagree on numbers, on motives, on blame. What no source disputes is the outcome. 7 legions marched in. None marched out. And the man who tried to finish what Crassus started would fail even worse, dragging Rome into another catastrophe in the same unforgiving desert.